Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you all so much for being here and helping kick off the 2025 Museum Lecture Series. This is a series that we started last year. It takes place on the last Saturday of every month. Admission is $5 and members get in for free. So if you enjoy this one and you're thinking of becoming a member, we can credit your $5 towards an annual membership, which is $25 for individuals and $35 for dual memberships. My name is Sylvie Andrews, and I'm the director of the Gresham Historical Society. And I am here to introduce Bruce Haney, who is a really fantastic local historian, the official town historian of Boring. And I'll let him say the rest. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you. So we're going to be telling some boring stories tonight. Hopefully it won't be too boring. And those are my only boring jokes. Right up. So don't worry, it's not going to be all punny all night. So a little bit about me. I work in the town of Boring. I didn't grow up there. People always ask if I was related to the family of Boring. Nope. And I just started wondering about the old buildings about 9 years ago, because we do have some buildings that are from the turn of the century, the last one. And I thought I would put the information on Facebook, see if anybody cared, and thought maybe like 50 people would. But actually, we have like 4,000 people now. So it became a bigger thing than I thought it was. And because of that, I got invited to do a monthly, like 5-minute speech at the Boring CPO, Community Planning Organization. And since I had an audience, I wanted to find fun stories. I didn't just want to go, this building was built in 1905, then Bob owned it, and then it became this. I wanted to find stories that would be fun. And I did. And after a couple years of that, I realized I had enough stories to put into a book. And so I have a book, Eccentric Tales of Boring, Oregon. And most of these stories can be read in further detail in that. So the stories I'm going to cover, I'm going to talk about the time the town was burnt down and it was blamed on firecrackers. I'm going to tell the dynamite mystery story. I'm going to talk a little bit about Heidi's. It's in Gresham, the restaurant. It used to be in Boring, so we'll talk about that. And we'll tell a few other stories, but we'll end with everyone's favorite story, the boxing story. So the thing that everyone's going to wonder all night, if I don't get it out of the way, is why is the town called Boring? So the town is named after William Boring. He was born in Illinois. He was an American Union warrior, soldier in the Civil War. And after that, him and his family ended up moving to this area. For them, it was later, so they didn't have to go on the trail. They were able to take a train to San Francisco and then a boat up to Portland. And they got land on his brother's property, Joseph Boring. And you might wonder why it's named after William and not Joseph if Joseph was here first. And that's because William Boring donated land for the first school in about 1883. But there wasn't much going on in Boring for the next 2 decades. There's a few small sawmill operations, some potato farmers, things like that. But 1903 is when they were put on the map. And that's when we got the train that came through, we got a depot, got a post office, and J.W. Root's merchandise, which he rebuilt in 1906. And is anyone familiar with this building here? It is. It looks a little different because at this time they entered on this side, but now you enter on the front. It's a McCall's convenience store. So that building's been there since 1906. So that's the brief history of the town, which kind of set the foundation for the stories. This is also, you can see McCall's store back when it was probably W.R. Telford's at that time right there, and the post office next to it. And where that white building is where the Shell gas station is now. So I'm dedicating this presentation to Glenda Boring, who just recently passed. She was the wife of Bob Boring, who was the fourth generation from William Boring. And they were the sweetest people ever, so nice. And a few years ago, there was a commercial filming Boring called Fragrance Burst, and they were interviewing Bob and Glenda about what Boring has and what it doesn't. And Glenda said, well, Boring doesn't have any gangs, right, Bob? Boring doesn't have any gangs. He's like, yeah, they don't. But that got me thinking, so I jumped on the newspaper archive, searched Boring gang, and I found one. All the way back in 1919. And the town called them bandits and said they went on a reign of terror. But that's an exaggeration. They hit the post office, they hit the school, they hit the train depot, and even the general store. But they always hit them at night. So the way they were caught is Sheriff Wilson was out looking for moonshiners. It's 1919, Prohibition's not everywhere, but Oregon had been dry for a few years. So he's out there looking for moonshiners when he comes across a shack. And inside he finds things like inner tubes, some purses, pipes, tobacco. And then they also find a ledger or journal of the criminals, which if you are a criminal and you do have a gang, writing it down is probably a bad idea. And so in that book, they listed their bylaws, which was you got to respect the captain, be quiet when you're on a sneak, and what's the third one? And don't tell anyone about the clubhouse. And so they also listed their crimes in this ledger, which double bad. And then worst of all, if you're gonna have a gang, you're gonna have a ledger, you're gonna write it all down, you're gonna put the crimes there too. Don't put your names. Well, they did. It was Laurel and Vernon Wilson and Walter Womaget. And Vernon was the leader, and I think that's because he was the oldest member of the gang at 14 years old. And the other two were privates. They were 12 years old. So, Wild West Club's short-lived. Boring boys form club for purpose of robbing neighborhood. But they did get in a little bit of trouble. So, the two younger boys got a good talking to by the district deputy attorney. And then the leader, he got sent to juvenile correction facility. So, rough. And that's the Wild West gang of Boring. So I consider that a lighter story. And so I'm going to tell you probably the darkest story of the evening. And I call it the Boring Dynamite Mystery. And I call it a mystery because I'm not 100% sure that the person they thought did it intentional. But we'll go through it. So the Jones family were a popular family in Boring. And they had just got a new house a month previous. And many people came out and helped celebrate their new house, including the neighbor who sold it to them, Albert Johnson. But sadly, a month later, tragedy would hit them. So the family was Robert and Ines, were the mother and father. And the children was Earl, who was from Robert's first marriage, but his mother died when he was around 2. So Ines really was his mother. That's who he knew. And then there was Richard, Ethel, and Harold. And so that morning, Ines is making breakfast, and Robert and Earl are sitting at the table. And then Earl excuses himself, saying he's not feeling well. And when he goes outside, moments later, the house explodes. And it was a bad tragedy, and we'll try to get past the darker part of it quickly. The 3 that were affected the most were the mother, father, and the youngest boy. Robert was the only one to survive, but he was gravely injured and would be in the hospital for 8 months. and they suspected the oldest boy. And the reason they were looking at him first is he did have a little bit of a troubled history. He had stolen the family car a year previous and drove it to California and never explained why. And then when he came back, his dad kept on kind of short leash, and they would fight over him not being able to go to things like the basketball game in Sandy. And he didn't help his case. When he was arrested, he would say things like, 4 of my aunts are in the asylum, which doesn't look good. He asked about the insurance money, and after being repeatedly asked, he told the sheriff, I didn't set that off, but I don't remember setting it off, but if I do, I'll tell you. So it's kind of a little snot. But I've seen this before. I followed the West Memphis 3 case in the 90s and early 2000s. There were 3 boys who were wrongly convicted, in my opinion and a lot of people's opinions, for a murder, and mostly because they wore Metallica shirts and with no evidence. But the reason I bring it up is Damien, the main kid in that, whenever he was interviewed, he was such a little brat. And years later, when he kind of became an adult in prison, he's like, I didn't know. I figured you can't be committed to a crime you didn't commit. So I was, a teenager. I was acting up. So they couldn't do the trial for 8 months. They had to wait for the father to be well enough. And his father always said, no way that Earl did this. And even the neighbors raised money to get him out on bail. But when it did go to trial, and first-degree murder, and the jurors couldn't decide either. They had 3 days of trial, and then the 12 hours for the jurors to figure out they were never going to come to a conclusion. So the trial was deadlocked. So 6 months later, he goes in front of the court, and he goes for a lesser charge of manslaughter and gets 3 years. And he said at the time that I am not guilty of this crime. I am, however, morally guilty, as I am the one who placed the powder under the house. And this caused the deaths. I want to start serving my sentence and get it over with. And I never found any other crimes he committed after that. The only thing mentioned of him at all is he tried to escape prison, him and another guy, but it wasn't like a big, complex, plans, map, digging in a hole. Mainly the guard was looking the other way, and they just took off, caught 50 feet later. And so from the dark story, let's go light. Let's talk about Heidi's. So Heidi's restaurant in Gresham, family restaurant. People have been going to there for over 40 years. They started in Boring back in 1968 as a coffee shop. And after a few years, they did well enough that they were able to expand it. And it was Don and Marie Eklund who built the property. So in 1972, they expanded. They started a bakery with this baker. And from there, they blew up even more. They had a clock shop, a boutique, gift shops, and they had the little train that went around. And most people, you can see this train, it's just driving around the parking lot. Most people remember it when it was on the tracks. And you can still see the tracks in that parking lot. And this is, the Boring exit is where it's at, where Chester's is now and where Sammy's was up to a couple weeks ago. And the Bigfoot Center, we got that out there too. But all those buildings, were Heidi's businesses at one time. And so I'm excited to show, has no sound, but 20 seconds of video of Heidi's back in the probably late 70s. So you got the train going around. I just can't believe I found footage of this. I love the hair and the dresses. Especially you'll see soon. That hairdo, love it. And from there, they expanded even further. They built the Alpenhaus, which is right there, which you might recognize the building, still there. It's now Chester's. That ball at the top, from what locals tell me, is it was hit by lightning and never replaced. And the cool thing about Heidi's is that it's kind of modern. All these other stories, I have to look in the newspaper archives. I have to look at census records. If I'm lucky, I have family histories to look upon. But Heidi's, people remember. They're still around. So in the Facebook group, every time I put Heidi's up, I hear something new. Like, do you know it had putt-putt golf? That they had remote control boats. They had an arcade. And for a very short period, they had helicopter rides. And this was short-lived because it really freaked out the neighbors' cows. But eventually they would move, Heidi's to Gresham. And it's been many things since then. But I want to use that reference to a cow to go into the boys of boring section. And I'll first tell you the cow incident. So the boys of boring there's a few of them, but there's Miles Aubin is the main one to me because he was the town historian before I was. Sadly, I got into this after he had passed, so I never got to meet him. But him and two kids named Don and Ritz, and then Kenny Valberg, whose family owned a lot of the town at this point, they would try to raise money. One way they did it was peeling cascara bark. Does anyone know what cascara bark was used for? Sylvia? Laxative. And they could sell it to the local pharmacist. But some people didn't go to the pharmacy to get their cascara. They'd peel the bark and make a tea out of it. And there was like a clever little rhyme that was really popular at the time because so many people used this product. And it went, "Little Mary swallowed a clock one day, and now she drinks cascara tea to pass the time away." And another way the boys of boring would raise money is moving cattle. And they'd move them from like the Sunshine Valley area to Haley Road. And most people don't know is that at one time, just for a few years, there was a train offshoot that went out there. And they got all the wood they wanted and then tore it out, but they left all the trestles. So the kids liked to play on them, and when it was time to move these cows, they decided that'd be a nice shortcut. So they're moving the cows, and one of them steps on a 6-inch crack, and her foot goes through. And the boys try to push her, they try to pull, and they're having no luck at all. So they get the bright idea. We'll go underneath and push her leg up. And just one of them did it. And when he did this displeased the cow, and she showed her displeasure onto his head. And then, as soon as she did this, she lifted her leg and just walked right across like nothing happened. And I was like Kenny Valberg, when he told this story, he always said it was springtime and the cow manure was nice and green. But he used a different word for manure. So another Miles Aubin story is one he calls the counterfeiters. I call it Albin, boy inventor and crime solver. And so this was a kid they knew who said he was going to be a detective, said he was an inventor. He said he invented a device that could take a letter and shoot it to the moon in 5 minutes. It blew up on its first and only attempt. And he was the kind of kid that would order like detective manuals from the back of comic books with fingerprinting kits and things like that. And so they got the idea to mess with him. And so they told him that there was counterfeiters operating in the woods a mile outside of Boring. So this would be where they would have walked into the woods. The white building right there, that's where Shell gas station is now. Timber Tavern's right there. And so they would have walked about a mile in. But to set this up really well, they got an adult to help them with this. A guy named Click Humphrey, who they also said was kind of a giant kid. And he's out there, he's got 2 of his buddies, he's got a car, and only Albin doesn't know this isn't real. So like 4 of them walk out into the woods, they get to the people, and Click Humphrey goes, "Hey, what are you guys doing here?" And then he pulls out a gun, shoots it twice, boom, boom. And Don and Rich throw themselves on the ground and start going, I've been shot. And by the time they stopped laughing, they realized Albin's gone. He ran so fast out there, he lost his hat. And he ran all the way to town and then ran to this white building here, which was the Oddfellows Hall, where they were having a dance. And he runs up there, runs up the stairs, flips open the door, and yells, Don and Rich have been shot by counterfeiters. And he tries to get like a posse going to go beat these people up or capture them or whatever. But lucky for him, May Humphrey, Click's wife, was there. And I gotta imagine she was mortified by this, because she had to be the one to go, oh, my husband, he pulled a prank. And she was a respected member of the community, too. She became the postmaster for many years. But she was able to calm it down, and everyone had their laugh, and they moved on. So those are the boys of boring stories. And so one thing I was excited about when I started doing research is this fact right here. Boring had a theater. Nobody knows that Boring had a theater. And they did, and we'll talk about that because it was involved in the big fire of 1922. And this was a huge fire. It was big enough that it made the front page of the paper, 2 different articles above the fold. And the interesting thing about this is that the facts are different. They have different names, different amount of buildings, either 4 or 8 buildings. From all my research into it, I think there was 4 buildings that burned. They just had 8 businesses in them. But the one article blames firecrackers, and then the other article says, we don't know what happened. And none of the locals ever said they heard firecrackers. So there's not many photos. Well, this is the only photos, not many. There's one of the town where this fire would have been. And so this is on the side of the road that like Timber Tavern is now, and the 2-story brick building, and where the hardware store used to be. And that's where this all went down. So it's a Thursday night, and the people are watching the Thursday night movie because they only had movies on Thursday. And this was a novelty for Boring because they only got the license 1 month previously. So the people are watching it, and then the projectionist noticed this weird light in the corner. And he's looking at it, and eventually he realizes, oh, that's fire, and it's spreading. So he had to yell fire and get everyone out of there. Luckily, there's some panic, but everyone got out okay. Only person got hurt was someone who had an apartment in the building, and he ran back up and fell down the stairs on his way back out. But basically, other than his ego, he was fine. And so the members of Boring, they're all standing out there watching the building burn. They're not sure what to do at first. And then they jump into action. People start jumping into the Boring garage, which was below it, and pulling out cars. But sadly, like the back part of the building was on fire, and that's where they kept their giant hose for trying to put fires out. Because Boring didn't have a fire department at that time, and wouldn't for like 2 more decades. And they did call to Sandy and Gresham, their fire department. But if you think the roads are bad now, in the 20s, they were like dirt and ruts, and maybe, if you're lucky, some planks. So neither Sandy or Gresham could make it out there with their fire apparatuses. So the town had to run a hose from their train depot, their beautiful train depot. But by the time they ran it, the fire pretty much was consuming the buildings, and there was so little water pressure at that time, anyways, it didn't do much good. So luckily, because the fire started jumping across the street, so we almost didn't lose just that side of the street businesses. We could have lost the other ones. But Sandy and Gresham ended up getting out there in different vehicles with buckets, and they got a bucket brigade going on, started throwing water on all the houses nearby, and saved it. And this was a fire that was so big that they wrote in the paper that people could see it in Portland like well after midnight. And I used to say this story that Boring had a theater, but it burned down 1 month later. But recently, I found an ad. That ad at the beginning of Boring having another theater in 1925. So Boring not only had a theater, they had two. And so I want to talk a little bit about moonshiners, but not too much, because there was a beautiful presentation here a couple months ago, Spirits and Speakeasies, that Melissa Bevensey did, right? Yeah, pronounced it right. So I won't cover too much, but there's lots of boring moonshiners. And the one I want to talk about is a man named Stillman Andrews. And the papers wrote, well, maybe it was the name that brought on the prohibition agents. And it wasn't. They actually said that the scent, the name probably put them on a scent, but it was the scent that is how they actually found it. Because that's kind of what you did when you were trying to bust bootleggers, is you would go out to where you think they're operating and try to smell for the fermentation or what have you. And they did. And they went out in the woods, and they found he had a big dugout hole in the ground with tarp over it and stuff covering it. So it actually is hidden pretty well. And from there, they were able to follow a track, a well-worn path from there to Stillman Andrews' barn, where they found caramel coloring, bottles, and other things you would use for selling liquor. And he did have a good way to move it if he was actually selling liquor, because he owned Andrews Meat Market, which was located in Pleasant Home area. And when it went to trial, one thing they mentioned is that they thought he was connected to Nettie Kinnett, the kind of local infamous Nettie Kinnett. I just want to tell one brief story about her. There's a story that isn't documented, well, until I wrote about it in my book, Oregon Moonshine, but it was just kind of told from person to person, and I've heard it in Sandy, is that she was on her way to Oregon City to sell off some moonshine when she got busted, well, actually stopped by prohibition agents. And they go, hey, do you know where Nettie Kinnett lives? And she's curious because, it's her. And she goes, oh, why are you looking for old Nettie? And they go, well, we think she's moonshining. And she goes, okay, well, she's back that way, left. And actually gives them directions to her house. And then she goes to Oregon City and sells off her moonshine. But when Stillman Andrews went to trial, he told him that the prohibition agents were drunk. And I don't know if they believed him or not, but he got not guilty. And I did find articles a year later, that same prohibition agent, people claiming he was drunk. And he admitted to it too, not admitted to being drunk, but he admitted, well, I had to try it. I had to know if it's real moonshine or not. And so here we're towards the end, and I want to tell you my favorite story, the prize fighter versus the boring boxer, or the boring boxing story, as I call it. And this is the first story ever told at the boring CPO all those years ago. This is when I was interviewed for KGW as well. If you look up on YouTube, you can see it. They added animation, which is really cool. So the town of Boring had a bully problem, and the guy's name was Free Coldwell. No pictures exist of him, but the Oregonian did a good job of describing him. They said he had red hair and arms like a gorilla. But they also claimed he had the punch of an infant, which I think is just them doing him dirty, because he was beating up on everyone, and the town was really sick of it. And they also said he walloped many boring pugilist aspirants into dreamland. And so the town got sick of this guy. So they went to Portland, where this guy, Tommy Burns, a real prize fighter, a real kind of upcoming guy that people knew the name of, who was training. And they had him come out and fight him for a purse of $3.40, which has the buying power of like $120, at least when I researched this 4 years ago. Now, who knows what money is. But he agrees to it, and I don't think he agreed to it for the money. I think he just didn't like Free Coldwell out there claiming to be a prize fighter when he's not. I've looked it up. There's no Free Coldwell prize fighter. There's actually not a Free Coldwell in the census records either. So whoever he was using a fake name. And this is Boring circa this time. We're talking 1905. And you can see this is the Boring Hotel. So Boring had a hotel. And the building that's kind of center-ish right there is T.M. Allison's Saloon. And if this was slightly higher quality, you would be able to read that it says Weinhard's Beer in big letters. They said it was the first place for alcohol when you came back from Estacada and the last place when you were heading towards Estacada. But that's about all people know about the saloon because no one really talked about it, other than I know behind the bar was a painting of a giant pig. That's all I know about it. And that there, if you see, the ground is rough out there, so there's all these pathways. And behind T.M. Allison's saloon that you could get to there through the pathway was what they called their opera house. It wasn't really an opera house. It's where they had dances and things like that. And so that's where they set up the boxing match. And the people of Boring had never had a boxing match before, so they had to build a rink. And it was said that it was so small that people complained, you can hold 2 infants in that thing. And when Tommy Burns came out, he said he was afraid he was going to fall through the floor. So before the fight can happen, they have to agree on who's going to pay the fee for the hall, which was 75 cents. Why the town of Boring wasn't paying for it, they dragged this guy out there, I don't know. But originally, whoever won would pay the 75 cents. And Free Coldwell was like, if I win, I'm not paying the 75 cents. And Tommy Burns agreed to this. Yeah, the loser can do it because Tommy Burns knew he was not going to be the one to pay it. He was going to win. And because Tommy Burns had such a name, they had him fight under a fake name as Mr. Brusso. And he was a lighter heavyweight, but he was a heavyweight. So when Free Coldwell seen Tommy Burns, a.k.a. Mr. Brusso, he went, oh, I could beat up a whole county, Clackamas County of Mr. Brussos. And the town gave him one rule. He said, you can beat him up as much as you want, but don't kill him. We don't want to pay to bury him. And many people came out for this fight. About 100 people came from Portland. And I always wonder was this town ready? Could T.M. Allison keep up with all those thirsty pugilist fans? So the cool thing about this fight is Tommy Burns, a.k.a. Mr. Brusso, really played it up. He pretended not to be as good as he was, and even let Free Coldwell hit him a couple times. He went down a couple times. And the people who knew this was a put-on must have been howling with laughter. And it wasn't until the 5th round that Free Coldwell finally got hit hard by Tommy Burns, a.k.a. Mr. Brusso, when he popped him in the nose. And the papers wrote that it was the same color as his hair. And then the very next round, the first time that Tommy Burns, a.k.a. Mr. Brusso, punches him in the stomach, he jumps out of the ring, Free Coldwell. He says, you can't punch someone in the stomach. And they're like, well, yeah, you can. Get back in the ring or you're a loser. And Tommy Burns will be the winner, or Mr. Brusso will be the winner. And he won't do it. And I think, so he did lose. And I think the town of Boring at first was very disappointed because he didn't get the beating that they hoped he would. Because he'd been bothering them for a long time. But they got their revenge, and I think he left town right away after this because that was such an embarrassment, especially when the Oregonian ran this article the next day. Just a quitter. Boring's town terror done by prize fighter. Buncoed by Tommy Burns. Meets noted pugilist under an alias. When he gets a blow in the stomach, Free Coldwell screams, no fair, and quits for good. And so I think he just left, and you never hear mention of him after this. And so a really interesting postscript to this story that I really love is, like I said, Tommy Burns is a real prize fighter. He's up and coming, and this $3.40 was nothing to him. Because this next fight he had 2 years later, or this big fight, was for $1,600. It's a lot of money in 1907, this fight would have been. And he won that fight against Marvin Hart and became the world heavyweight champion. So those are the stories I have for you. Those are all my boring stories. And I am available for questions and answers. Thank you. Yeah.
How did the train depot thing? Did that burn down?
It burned down in 29. And we had the train tracks going out there all the way to like 1990 for the sawmills.
And they turned that into rails and trails. That's part of the spring water now.
It is, yeah. And it goes about 3 miles past Boring to where the Deep Creek Bridge used to be. But when it burned down, they just never built it back. Because it used to go all the way to Estacada.
Yeah, I have heard that Boring and Dull, Scotland didn't come back.
I know about it. I don't know if,
I think somebody from Chicago was listening.
yeah. I think that's it. And we're also twin communities with a place called Bland as well. But Boring and Dole, that's the main one. What is it?
It's the League of External
Yeah.
Communities was trademarked, but Steve Bates, the unofficial mayor of Boring, is the guy that started doing that. And it was because the people from Dull came to Boring. And it was their idea to leave the two together. And when we did Boring and Dull Day, it was a state holiday voted on by the House and the Senate and signed by Governor Kitzhaber, who said that was the most fun he ever had as governor. And after that happened, Boring became world famous. In fact, I was interviewed. I had to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning one morning to get interviewed by Scottish TV when the mayor of Bland, Australia was in Dull. And when you're driving through Boring, if you see people stop taking pictures in the park of the Boring sign, and you walk over to talk to them, 50-50 chance the people taking the pictures are from Scotland. And they come through Boring just to take a picture of the sun.
Thank you, Fitz. Yes.
Heidi's village, this village, Jack Elmer is the baker.
Yeah, and, I've been reciting the speech all week, memorizing it, and all of a sudden, Jack Elmer's name was gone. On the Boring and Dole thing, I would like to say that we do celebrate it in town every August 9th at the park. We do an ice cream social. I always have my history booth. We have a live band. It's a lot of fun. And a parade, but isn't it the...
Second shortest parade in the state of Oregon.
That's right.
By the way, we had 600 people last year.
Wow.
Whenever we travel, you check into a hotel and they'll say where you're from and you have to write down your address. And when we put Boring, Oregon, they say, really? My husband says, yeah, you know what happens there every year? All the time.
Yeah.
And they get off and say, what? And he says, absolutely not.
Well, now you have some boring stories you can tell.